What's up, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be talking about 7 lessons I learned in my first year of writing. So I started writing on Substack about a year ago because I realized that I needed to develop the ability to articulate myself. So I set a goal to write 1 blog post every single week and didn't have too many constraints past that on what they had to look like, what the word count was, what the subject was on. No restrictions like that. I just wanted to force myself to write more and set that goal of 1 post per week. So in hopes that I would advance my ability to articulate myself through that process. I posted my first blog post on October 9th of 2023. And for the sake of transparency, I did actually miss 2 weeks of posting a blog throughout the year. So I can't say that I completely achieved my goal of posting every single week, but did get 50. So I'll take that. And writing has turned out to be turned out to have much more of an impact than I expected going into this process. And so it's had such an impact that's led me to try to convince many of my friends to write as well. So I figured I'd bundle it all into a video covering the few lessons that I've learned along the way. So with that, let's dive in. Lesson number 1 is writing is formalized thinking. So when I'm about to write, I tend to think that I have a clear understanding of the idea or the story that I want to convey. And that when I sit down to write it out, it's just going to be clear on the page immediately because I have such a fundamental understanding of it. And then I sit down and that's not what happens at all. As I begin to write, the words on the page don't articulate what I'm thinking at all. The idea is incomplete, there's significant gaps in my thoughts, the paragraph sentences and words lack meaning and appear to be just completely out of order, and I don't know how to fix it. I sit there struggling, and it hurts to see how poorly the words on the page reflect the idea that I'm trying to convey. Through this writing process, though, I can literally see on the page how bad my communication is on a particular idea or subject. And even as I wrote down this lesson, I experienced that same process. And there's a term for this, your first stab at writing something, and it's called a rough draft. And if you're anything like me, version 0 of your rough draft is always terrible. It's just incoherent words vomited onto the page. And what I've learned is that this is the process of thinking. And when you're thinking, you're not sure where you're going. You're trying to move your understanding forward, trying to get from point A to point B, but you're not exactly sure where point B is. And you certainly don't know the straightest path to get there. So that process of vomiting everything onto the page, trying to understand where these thoughts are taking you, nailing down the destination, and then trying to delete all that unnecessary fluff between A and B, that's the process of thinking. But the catch is that I and most people often think by talking. And when we think by talking, we're speaking out loud our roughest of drafts onto the world. We're dragging people through this windy path because we don't even know where we're headed. And we tend not to notice because unlike when it's written, we can't literally see how poor our thinking is. And I call this process of talking out loud, thinking out loud, rough draft speaking. So I try to do a whole lot less rough draft speaking now. It's because it's just so much better to vomit those words out onto a page first instead of onto somebody else. And one last thing I'll mention here is, since it was a bit of a revelation for me, is that when really articulate people take long pauses before answering a question, this is the process that they're going through in their heads. They're trying to identify that point B and the best way to articulate their message to get from point A to point B before they open their mouth. So I'm trying to do a whole lot more of that. Still something I struggle with, but trying to get better at that. So yeah, writing is formalized thinking. Lesson number 2 is tell a story. There's an old proverb that reads, "Tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever." And of the first 50 posts that I wrote, 7 of them were stories from my own life. And I found that those posts were by far the most interesting and engaging for the people who were reading them. And this is important because if you're trying to articulate a lesson or a concept to a group of people, you want to understand what makes that lesson stick. And this year, I read this book titled Storyworthy by Matthew Dix, where he breaks down how to be an effective storyteller. And I can't recommend this book enough. And one of the things that really stuck with me from the book is this idea that he coins called cinema of the mind, which is a concept that as the storyteller, it's your job to create a movie in the mind of your audience. They should be able to see and experience that story as you lead them through it. And if you can do that effectively, your story or your lesson has a much better chance of landing and sticking with your audience. Lesson number 3 is writing pinpoints, misalignments, and disagreements. So writing makes it much easier for someone to tell you exactly where they disagree with you or think that you may be off track. And it does this by allowing the reader to move through your thoughts at their own pace and removing the burden of the listener worrying about whether or not they should interrupt you in the middle of your rant. And as they read, they can circle or highlight specific words or sentences on the page and show you exactly where they disagree with you. They don't have to try to memorize a point that you made while you continue to talk. And I genuinely feel that this can make a conversation more productive easily by a factor of 10. And an example of when I do this is with a mentor of mine named Alum. So Alum sits on the board and is invested in Sway, which is the company I lead. So obviously the effectiveness of our conversations is extremely important. And frequently when we meet, I'll actually come to those meetings with one page or multiple pages of content for him to read at the very beginning. And when I can do this effectively, he can digest in under 5 minutes what may have taken us an entire hour or more to get through. And as he reads what I've written, he can pinpoint exactly on the page where he thinks I'm off track or thinks he needs some clarification or wants to challenge my assumptions or logic, which just as a quick clarification is exactly what I'm asking him to do. And this process gives me invaluable insight into where my articulation of certain ideas is strong and where it's weak. And that allows me to dial in my messaging going forward. And so you've obviously got to balance the amount of time you put into the writing itself, because you don't want to spend 10 hours writing to prepare for every 30-minute conversation you're going to have. But when you consider that you'll understand your own thoughts with an order of magnitude of more clarity by just writing for 15 to 30 minutes and the benefits that the reader gets from that, a lot of times I think that 15 or 30-minute investment is well worth the time. Lesson number 4 is writing ensures that the story communicated up, down, and across the chain of command is consistent. So within organizations, there are many different conversations that happen. And if you're a leader, which you are, you need to make sure that the narrative and the details of that story that you're sharing is consistent across all those conversations. This is easier said than done though, but by writing your thoughts down and sharing them, you greatly increase the odds that your story is going to be the same across all of those conversations, because anyone can reference your written word, and it allows those people in the organizations to come to you and ask clarifying questions in a very specific manner to see where they may have misinterpreted something that you said or disagreed with something that you said. Lesson number 5 is writing creates transparency. So if you write something and then you share that, even if people don't know that you've shared it up the chain of command, they know that they can hold you to your word. And that in itself creates this feeling of transparency. And that feeling is not false, because you can and you should be held to those words. If you've ever worked with someone who you suspect says different things to different people, this idea should resonate with you. Because if someone writes out their thoughts and emails them to everyone or posts them in a place where everyone can see them, you know for certain what's being communicated across the organization, which creates transparency. Lesson number 6 is that writing lasts through time, and it aligns us on what happened in the past. And so one of the stories I love here is that during the Korean War, Chesty Puller, who is a legend in the Marine Corps, writes to his wife, "Everything is quiet and I now have little to do except get my reports prepared and submitted. I wish I had a flair for writing, as I am certain this regiment would get the credit due them when the history of this operation is finally written. Now everyone knows, but in a few years what is written will govern. Rest assured that I will do a better job of getting the facts in my reports than I did in the past war. I will also claim everything due the regiment." And that line, "in a few years what is written will govern," really stuck with me, because as our memory fades with time, if we take the opportunity to write down what has happened and how those things have transpired as they do in real time, we allow ourselves the ability to reflect on that and learn the lessons of our own history. Because if we aren't aligned on our history, then we won't be aligned on the lessons that we learn from our history. And that applies both to us as individuals and as a group of people. So writing down what's happened so we can be aligned on the history, so we can be aligned on the lessons learned from that history is super important. Lesson number 7 is my audience is my future self. So a while back, I stumbled upon this journal that I had briefly started back in October of 2016. And this journal starts off with a letter from me to my future self, and it also has a few other entries in there as well. But when I opened it up and I read that letter and I read those entries from 2016, it felt as though I was able to go back in time and sit across the table and have a discussion with that kid. And I've got so many questions for that young man. You know, what was he thinking? How did he look at the world? What were his hopes and dreams for where he'd be in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? What would he think about where he ended up so far? What would he be proud of? What would he be ashamed of the things that he'd done along the way? And what were his values at the time, and how have those changed over time? So going through this journal showed me very clearly that my target audience for my writing is me. And it's me 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, maybe even 50 years down the road from now. So what do I want that guy to remember? What lessons do I need him to take to heart? What are his weak points that he needs to remain aware of? And how can I convey to him what I'm feeling in this moment so that 10 years, 50 years down the line, he can sit down at a table with me and explore the current texture of my mind and my thoughts. So when I'm writing, that's really what I'm trying to focus on. And what am I trying to convey to that guy in the future? What are the lessons that I'm learning right now that I don't want to lose, that I don't want to have to relearn over and over again by making the same mistake? So if others can benefit by bits of that writing along the way, that's great as well. But my target audience is definitely me a few years down the line. So that wraps up these 7 lessons from my first year of writing. When I started this journey, I did not know where it would take me or if it would stick. And I certainly couldn't have imagined it having the impact on me that it's had. I've thought a lot about trying to quantify that impact. The best metaphor I think I can give is that the perspective shift from not writing to writing has been just as impactful, if not more impactful, than the shift from not reading at all to reading. It's completely changed the texture of my mind, how I understand my own thoughts and my thought process, and how I look at the world. So if you're thinking about writing, I personally highly recommend that you take a stab at it, because I'm certainly glad that I did. So I'll be doing more of these types of videos in the future. So if you made it this far and enjoyed it, give it a like. And I appreciate you all. Keep getting after it.